The bells of the convent tolled through the morning fog. Once meant to summon the sisters to prayer, their sound had turned into a funeral lament. On the cold stone floor of Santa Margherita Convent in Monza lay an unmoving body. The white habit, a symbol of purity and devotion, was stained crimson. No one in Lombardy could have imagined that behind those sacred walls built to enclose virtue hid a story dark enough to challenge the church itself. Who was Virginia de Leyva really? A saint corrupted by passion, or a victim of a system that turned obedience into imprisonment? To answer that question, we must return to 16th century Europe, a continent divided by the Reformation and haunted by the shadow of the Inquisition. In northern Italy, Lombardy lived under the iron rule of the Spanish crown and the House of Habsburg. Power was measured not only in armies and territory, but in control over bodies, over silence, over souls. After the shock of the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church launched its own counterattack, the Counter-Reformation, a campaign to purify behaviour, reaffirm authority and tighten moral discipline across every sphere of life. Women's convents became the perfect instrument for that mission. They were spiritual fortresses, but also laboratories of control spaces where obedience was cultivated as virtue and silence as salvation. For the church they symbolized devotion, for the nobility they solved problems. To a wealthy family, sending a daughter to take the veil was not always an act of faith, it was strategy. Marriage meant paying a dowry, often large enough to fracture an estate. The convent, however, cost less and brought prestige. A cloistered daughter projected an image of holiness while protecting family wealth. In that balance between piety and profit, faith became currency. For noble girls, there was little room for choice. A woman belonged first to her father, then to her husband, or if she was unlucky, to God. Freedom was not an option. Some were sacrificed for politics, others for reputation, all in the name of honour. The convent promised sanctuary, but delivered a slow kind of burial, a spiritual tomb lined with hymns and stone. It was into this world that Virginia de Leyva was born in 1575, the daughter of Count Martin de Leyva, a man consumed by ambition and obsessed with lineage. To him, love was a distraction and family honour was sacred. Every decision was a calculation, every sacrifice justified. When Virginia turned 13, her fate was sealed. There would be no suitors, no courtship, no silk dresses or candlelit dances. Instead, she received a white habit and a new name, Sister Virginia Maria. At the age when most children still dream of what life might be hers was already overplanned, contained and senenced. Santa Margherita Convent was no refuge of peace. It was a fortress of discipline built to endure centuries and extinguish rebellion. From the outside, its high walls and iron gates inspired awe. Inside, life was ruled by the order and fear. Days began before dawn with matins, long hours of prayer, followed by silence, chores and penitence. They ended late at night with complin when even the moonlight seemed forbidden. Young novices knelt for hours on cold stone floors, reciting endless litanies until their knees ached and their minds blurred into numb devotion. Every breath, every glance was regulated. A smile at the wrong time could bring punishment. A whisper out of place could mean days of isolation. Virginia endured it quietly. But beneath the veil and crucifix, her heart still beat with something unholy memory. She remembered the colours of her home, the laughter of her youth, the taste of life before walls. The convent could confine her body, but not her imagination. Sometimes during the night, prayers when the only light came from flickering candles and the air was thick with incense and dampness, she would wonder, was this truly God's will or her father's? Was sanctity really so close to suffering? She began to understand that this was not a place for saving souls, but for taming them. Each passing day taught her the same cruel lesson: her vows were not an act of faith, but of property. The halls echoed not with divine grace, but with resignation. And somewhere deep inside, a small dangerous thought began to stir the wish to choose. That wish, unspoken, forbidden, and yet impossible to erase, would become the seed of everything that followed. For in the twilight world of Baroque Italy, obsessed with purity, hierarchy, and the illusion of moral perfection, a woman's defiance was more than sin, it was heresy. Virginia de Leyva did not yet know it, but her rebellion, born in silence, shaped by solitude, would one day shake an empire's faith in its own virtue. Hers was not merely the tragedy of a woman, it was the mirror of a system that feared the simplest of desires to live freely. Life inside Santa Margherita followed the same rhythm every day, a rhythm designed not to be lived, but to erase life itself. dawn began with the chill of stone and the call to prayer. The sisters' voices rose in unison, low and tremulous, echoing through the cloisters like waves breaking against a wall. Then came work cleaning, mending, tending. The small gardens fenced by iron. Silence filled the spaces between chores, a silence so complete it seemed to hum as if the building itself were breathing. In theory, Santa Margherita was a house of devotion. In practice, it was a carefully managed cage. The walls did not merely separate the nuns from the world, they restructured time. Hours were divided by bells, not by the sun. Conversations were replaced by gestures, a nod, a glance, a secret passing of folded paper. Emotions, too, had to be disguised. A sigh could be mistaken for sin, a tear might be seen as rebellion. And yet among those cloistered girls, something quietly human persisted. They formed small alliances, whispered friendships built on shared confinement. In the darkness after prayer they exchanged scraps of comfort. A hand squeezed in the hallway, a murmured word of reassurance, a half-remembered song from childhood. These tiny acts of tenderness were contraband, smuggled moments of humanity. But repression breeds not purity, only pressure. Behind every closed door, dreams accumulated like smoke. The longer the silence stretched, the more dangerous it became. Every forbidden thought of laughter, of colour, of love pressed harder against the walls of discipline. It was into that fragile ecosystem that a disturbance entered, one that began as most catastrophes do, with something small and almost beautiful. Outside the convent, life continued in Monza. The markets rang with the clatter of carts. Noblemen arrived on horseback for mass. Women in bright dresses crossed the square. On Sundays, the sisters attended services behind a wrought-iron screen that separated them from the congregation. It was there, according to both record and rumour, that Sister Virginia's eyes met those of a man named Gianpaolo Ossio, sometimes written Ozio. He was a young nobleman of striking appearance, dark eyes, fine clothes, a reputation equal parts charm and danger. Some said he had studied law, others claimed he was simply a man who understood how power worked, how to bend rules without ever appearing to break them. In the eyes of the city, Ossio was both admired and feared, the kind of man who drew trouble as easily as he drew attention. Their first meeting, as later told in both archives and legend, was brief. A glance through the iron grille, a pause too long to be innocent. Yet that moment suspended between shadow and light planted a spark that neither could extinguish. The historical documents do not confirm every detail. No court record can capture the trembling of a forbidden gaze, but the existence of their relationship is beyond doubt. Letters were found, later fragments of correspondence hidden in prayer books or stitched into folds of cloth. Some were signed with initials, others left blank, but all carried the unmistakable tone of longing. For Virginia, the connection was not merely romantic, it was existential. Ossio represented something she had forgotten existed: choice. In a world where every word, every breath, every breath, every hour was predetermined, the thought of being seen, desired, chosen by her own will was intoxicating. He began to appear near the convent more often, walking along its outer walls, timing his visits to the hours when the sisters were permitted in the garden. Sometimes a rose, sometimes a note found its way through the grate. To the guards and confessors it was invisible. To Virginia it was oxygen. In her cell she began to change. The rhythm of prayers no longer numbed her, it tormented her. Each psalm felt like an echo of the life she had lost, and yet beneath the guilt there was a thrill she could not deny. The habit still covered her body, but it no longer defined her. Beneath the white linen, the girl she once was, the one her father buried alive at 13, began to stir again. Every clandestine word, every hidden message became an act of rebellion against the machinery that had crushed her. The veil that once symbolized obedience now hid a secret world of feeling. It was not love that broke the convent's order. It was the memory of freedom disguised as love. Through the bars of that sacred prison, Virginia de Leyva began to feel the world return its warmth, its danger, its terrible beauty. She was no longer just Sister Virginia Maria, the dutiful nun. She was once again Virginia, the daughter of Lombardy, the woman who had been told to silence her will. And for the first time in years, she was ready to listen to her own heartbeat. Love rarely blooms in darkness without demanding a price. By the time the first rumours began to circle the cloisters of Santa Margherita, the affair between Sister Virginia and Gianpaolo Ossio had evolved from daring glances to a network of deception intricate enough to shame a court of spies. Ossio, accustomed to danger and calculation, began recruiting allies. A mason who tended the outer walls, a merchant who delivered wine to the convent, Even a priest who owed him favours all became links in a chain of secrecy. Through them, letters passed, messages whispered, and plans set in motion. Late at night, when the city slept and the convent's torches burned low, Ossio would slip through a concealed passage near the sacristy, aided by a small group of confidants. Inside, Virginia waited, trembling not with fear but with anticipation and guilt intertwined. By day, she was Sister Virginia Maria, obedient, serene, untouched by rumour. By night, she became again Virginia de Leyva, a woman of flesh, memory and longing. Her dual existence required precision. Her prayers had to sound pure, her voice unshaken even when her hand still bore the warmth of forbidden touch. Every secret encounter deepened both her hunger and her dread. What had begun as liberation now demanded maintenance, lies carefully layered over each other like mortar between stones. Each deception, no matter how small, left a crack, but walls, no matter how sacred, have ears. Among the novices was a young woman named Caterina, devout, curious, and perhaps too observant for her own safety. She had begun to notice small irregularities, a candle left burning where none should be, footsteps when the convent should have been asleep, Virginia's absence during hours of silence. Whispers began to circulate among the sisters, first as speculation, then as accusation. The archives record Caterina's death as accidental, a fall down the narrow stone stairs one late evening. Yet the people of Monza never believed in accidents that convenient. Chroniclers wrote later that she had threatened to expose Virginia in Ossio's meetings, that her conscience warred with her fear until one won. Which one, hers or theirs, is a question history never answered. There were no witnesses, only echoes. Some said they heard a cry, others only the dull sound of impact, followed by the swift mechanical tolling of the midnight bell. The following morning the sisters prayed over her body, and the abbess announced that Caterina had met a tragic misstep. Her soul, they said, had ascended in purity, but the air inside Santa Margherita changed. Virginia could feel it, the weight of eyes on her, the tightening of silence in every corridor. Every shadow seemed to murmur her name. The guilt, once abstract, became physical. It clung to her habit, to her breath, to the rhythm of her prayers. Ossio urged calm, assuring her that suspicion would fade. The church forgets quickly, he told her, when the scandal is buried deep enough. But Virginia understood something he did not. The church did not forget, it waited. The nights that followed were no longer tender, but tense. Their meetings, once desperate for touch, turned desperate for reassurance. She began to pray more fiercely than ever, perhaps out of fear, perhaps in defiance. But every word, forgive me, forgive me, forgive me, echoed hollow against the walls. The line between sinner and victim blurred. To protect what she called love, Virginia had entered into complicity not just with Ossio, but with the growing darkness that now surrounded them both. Whether she had lifted a hand against Caterina, or merely looked away, her penance made her a participant. And sustenance in such a place was not neutrality, it was consent. From that moment the path forward narrowed. There would be no return to innocence, no chance to unlearn the taste of freedom or the fear of discovery. Every breath became a negotiation with danger. Every morning began with the question of whether today would be the day it all unravelled. What began as a rebellion of the heart had become a conspiracy of survival. And in the quiet heart of the convent, where incense tried to mask the smell of guilt, Sister Virginia Maria prayed harder than ever, not for redemption, but for time. By the time whispers of Caterina's death began to fade, a new, far more dangerous secret had already taken root inside the walls of Santa Margherita, one that no amount of silence could contain. Sister Virginia Maria was with child. The signs came slowly hidden beneath layers of fabric and denial. A loosened belt, a longer prayer, a pallor that the abbess explained away as excess devotion. For a time the walls themselves seemed to protect her. No one dared question at a woman of noble blood, not openly. But in a convent nothing remains unseen for long. Eyes accustomed to reading gestures, to measuring every sigh and glance, soon began to notice what words could not conceal. According to surviving court records, the pregnancy became an open secret among a small circle of sisters, those who pitied her, those who feared her, and those too loyal to the vow of silence to speak. A few even helped her. They smuggled food, watercloth. They kept watch during the night. Some out of friendship, others perhaps out of the terrible recognition that in another life it could have been them. In the dead of winter, hidden beneath the chants of the divine office, Virginia gave birth. The event was neither miracle nor joy. It was an act of survival performed in near darkness. The cell that served as her chamber became a clandestine maternity ward, its walls muffling cries that could never be heard. The infant, a boy, according to most testimonies, came into a world where his first breath was already a sin. What happened next remains one of the most haunting mysteries in Italian ecclesiastical history. Official records confirm that a child was indeed born to Sister Virginia Maria de Leyva, but the documents end abruptly. His name was never recorded. His baptism, if it occurred, left no trace in parish books. Some later accounts claim that Ossio arranged for the baby to be taken from the convent and placed secretly in the care of a trusted family near Milan. Others insisted the child died shortly after birth, buried in unmarked ground to erase all evidence. Between those two possibilities lies a silence wide enough to swallow certainty. Historians who have studied the case agree on one thing: the gap itself matters as much as the facts. That absence, that deliberate omission, is the wound through which legend enters history. In the space where truth was erased, imagination took root. Over centuries, writers, preachers, and storytellers have filled that void with what suited their purpose: a tragic orphan, a murdered infant, a spectral child haunting the convent halls. Each retelling reveals less about Virginia's crime and more about the era's fear of women's desire, of transgression, of scandal that could stain the sanctity of institutions built on control. For Virginia, the silence was not theoretical, it was visceral. The baby's absence became her punishment, sharper than any whip, heavier than any chain. She was forbidden to speak of him, forbidden even to pray for him aloud. The few sisters who had helped her withdrew in terror, realizing that compassion had become complicity. The convent's air, once thick with whispers of curiosity, turned poisonous with guilt. But suppression demands maintenance, and maintenance demands more lies. The abbess, perhaps fearful of church investigators, perhaps protecting her own reputation, began to rewrite the story before anyone outside could. Illness, she called it, a malady of the stomach. Within weeks, all traces of the event had been cleaned away, linens burned, records altered. The midwife transferred to another convent under pretense of spiritual exhaustion. The system had perfected the art of erasure. What could not be purified had to be hidden, yet even buried the sandal festered. Those who knew the truth lived in a state of permanent tension, one misstep away from exposure. A look held too long, a word spoken out of turn could destroy them all. Prayer became a shield not of faith but of fear. Each sister prayed not for salvation but for silence. Virginia herself seemed suspended between worlds, neither mother nor nun, neither sinner nor saint. She continued her duties, reciting psalms with a composure that frightened even her confessors. But those who saw her closely swore that her eyes had changed. Behind their calm burned something unearthly, a mix of defiance and mourning. In the centuries that followed, the child she bore, nameless, voiceless, unrecorded, would become the most persistent ghost in history. His absence shaped the narrative more powerfully than his life ever could have. For every historian, every novelist, every pilgrim who whispered her name, that missing record was an invitation to imagine, to accuse, to mythologize, and thus what the church sought to erase became immortal. For in trying to hide a sin, they created a legend, and in sealing a record, they opened a wound that history has never been able to close. Her name was Ottavia, a young novice, barely 17, newly arrived at Santa Margherita, with a voice so soft it seemed afraid of echoing. She had come from a minor noble family in Bergamo, sent by her relatives in the same old way, not for devotion, but convenience. The convent, with its reputation for order and piety, was thought to be a safe place for her quiet nature. To Virginia, Ottavia was a mirror of what she herself had once been: naive, obedient, full of dreams that had not yet been broken. The older nun took her under her protection. At first it was kindness, the kind of gentle mentorship forbidden, but inevitable among women who shared confinement. Virginia offered her guidance, a softer voice amid the harsh regimen of the abbess. She taught her how to endure the endless prayers, how to avoid punishment, even how to smile without being noticed. But affection has its own gravity, and in a place starved of tenderness it can easily twist into something more dangerous. The court records mention Ottavia only in fragments, a name in testimony, a brief reference in the Inquisitor's notes. Yet her role in the tragedy that followed became one of the most haunting threads in Monza's memory. According to the depositions taken years later, Ottavia became entangled in Virginia's secret world, the network of coded notes, loyal accomplices, and illicit nighttime visits that kept the forbidden bond with Ossio alive. Whether she helped willingly or was manipulated into it is unclear. What is certain is that innocence never survives long in the company of fear. Soon Ottavia herself was whispered to be pregnant. The discovery, if it was ever fully proven, struck the convent like lightning. Some sources say it was Ossio, once more reckless and emboldened by years of impunity. Others claim Ottavia's pregnancy was used as a diversion, a fabricated scapegoat to protect Virginia from new suspicion. In the layers of testimony that survive truth and invention intertwine like roots beneath a grave. The official records describe her death as sudden illness. She fell ill, they say weakened and fevered, and died within days. No physician was summoned, no burial was recorded in detail, only a vague note. The sister departed this life in purity, but contemporary accounts outside the convent told a different story, one too grim to ignore. Neighbours swore they heard screams in the night. A messenger claimed to have seen blood-stained linen burned behind the convent walls at dawn. Chroniclers writing decades later, drawing on local legend, painted it as murder, that Ottavia was silenced to prevent her from revealing what she knew or what she carried. Whether or not the crime occurred exactly as rumour described the effect was the same. Fear took hold of Monza. The city that once admired the convent now looked upon it with suspicion. Whispers spread through taverns and marketplaces, through the pews of churches and the corridors of power. The sisters of Santa Margherita, people murmured, are not angels, they are shadows in habits. For the church scandal was contagion, but secrecy had its own epidemic. The more they tried to contain the story, the more it multiplied. Anonymous letters reached Milan. Chroniclers began to probe, and every death, every absence, every closed gate became proof of further sin. Inside, the tension reached breaking point. The sisters lived in a climate of collective dread of being seen, of being named, of being punished for the sins of others. Virginia, once merely a woman in conflict, now stood at the centre of something larger, a spiral of concealment that demanded sacrifice after sacrifice. The walls of the convent, built to guard purity, had become witnesses to desecration. What was meant to preserve sanctity had turned into a machine of silence, one that could only function through omission, through complicity, through the quiet removal of those who saw too much. Ottavia's death marked the final step in Virginia's descent. It was no longer about love or even survival. It was about control, about keeping intact the fragile illusion that what had already been damned might still be hidden. Each new lie required a body to disappear. Each disappearance demanded a new lie. In that fatal chain, morality ceased to exist. All that remained was the instinct to protect what little was left a secret that had long ago ceased to be a secret but still ruled them all. And outside the city listened. Monza's air, once filled with hymns and market cries, now vibrated with rumour. Behind those cold walls, people said even angels must tremble. The letter arrived without a name and without pity. Folded like a blade written in a calm, merciless hand, it travelled from Monza to Milan in the winter of 1607 and landed on the desk of the Archbishop Federico Borromeo. It accused Sister Virginia Maria de Leyva of a long and illicit liaison with a local nobleman, Gianpaolo Ossio. It hinted at pregnancies. It whispered of deaths behind walls where prayer should have been the only sound. Borromeo did not waste time. He ordered a canonical investigation, the kind the Church knew how to conduct with ritual precision. Commissioners appointed notaries, summoned witnesses, listed archives, opened questions, sharpened until they cut. The machinery awakened like an old, well-oiled engine. A vicar presided over the depositions. Scribes drew inked lattices of testimony. Sisters were separated and questioned alone. Habit and hierarchy became evidence. The abbess produced ledgers. Confessors were pressed for anything heard under the seal that could be lawfully revealed. Keys were counted, doors measured, windows inspected for sightlines to the street. Between the Compline bell and matins, the convent's silence filled with paper summonses, sworn statements, seals. What had survived as rumour hardened into record, but records do not stay still. They leak into streets. News of the inquiry spilled into Monza's markets, then into Milan's piazzas, where pamphleteers breathed life into every half-fact. Crowds gathered to trade increments of scandal, a new witness, a hidden passage, a sister who wept under questioning. The case became theatre actors, veiled and unveiled, a chorus of chroniclers stoking the fire, and above the stage the Church trying to direct the play toward a lesson in discipline. At the centre of the spectacle stood Ossio. On Carnival Day of 1607 he was seized and imprisoned at Pavia. Proof people said that even charm cannot outrun consequence. For a moment the city held its breath, ready for the perfect ending, a public execution, a moral diagram drawn in blood on stone. But the script did not oblige. Ossio escaped. The authorities condemned him to death in absentia, and the crowd, cheated of its finale, watched him vanish into rumour. Not long after he was murdered by a friend, said the reports as if betrayal were merely a footnote to sin. The body the city had expected to see on the scaffold was found offstage instead. The absence of a spectacle became its own spectacle. Some swore the escape proved Satan's favour. Others insisted it revealed human rot in the city's own sinews. Guards bribed, doors opened, justice mocked. Printers obliged with broadsheets that stitched certainty to suspicion until they were indistinguishable. In taverns and drawing rooms, people rehearsed the story as if they had been there for every turn of the key. The more the church urged restraint, the louder the appetite grew. What began as a dossier had become a public appetite fed daily, never sated. Inside the chancery, the tone remained colder. Investigators moved from logistics to souls. Questions probed the grammar of guilt, who first lowered the note on a string, who forged the duplicate key, who kept watch while sin walked in, the blacksmith's name appeared. Then another accomplice, then whispers of blood. The inquiry widened like a crack in ice, one step then another, until the whole surface trembled. Each deposition cross-referenced the last. Each correction sharpened the outline of a world in which piety had cohabited with calculation. And yet even this clean version of events, dates, arrests, escapes could not contain the city's imagination. There were those who swore they had seen Osseo paraded through the streets, others who claimed he had fled to Switzerland in disguise, still others who insisted that his corpse lay beneath a noble palace in Milan. In one telling, he died like a wolf, in another, like a penitent. All the while, the archival trail held steady arrest-escape sentence in absentia murder by supposed friends. The legend metastasized around a spine of iron facts. For Virginia, the spectacle changed the air she breathed. Summoned, questioned, returned to her cell. Summoned again, she became a passage in her own indictment. The very skills the convent taught, poise, restraint, the smoothing of voice, now worked against her. To the commissioners, serenity looked like calculation. Tears looked like theatre. She pleaded a soul battered by forces beyond her will, a heart trapped in a system that praised obedience and rewarded silence. The pages recorded her words without sympathy. The investigation was not a conversation. It was a narrowing corridor leading forward and only forward. Beyond the walls, the city swelled with moral fervour. Milan, in the age of surveillance, believed in the pedagogy of example every scandal demanded, a counter-scandal of discipline. From pulpit and page alike came the same refrain: institutions must be defended not only by doctrine but by visible correction. The case offered the church a chance to warn, to cleanse, to prove that cloisters were not lawless islands but provinces of order. The appetite of the crowd made the task crueler but clearer. Osseo's fall, incomplete and messy as it was, served that purpose anyway. A condemned man vanished, then dead became an emblem. He stood in for temptation itself, handsome, persuasive, fatal. And the crowd, denied its neat tableau on the scaffold, turned to the next best performance, the continuing trial of a woman whose vows had become evidence, whose solitude now looked like crime. By the close of that year, all parties were trapped in their roles, the public as chorus, the chroniclers as prompters, the church as director, determined to wrest meaning from chaos. What began with an anonymous letter had become a morality play with the city as theatre and the convent as stage. The curtain had not yet fallen, but the lesson was already being written. In times obsessed with purity, scandal is not merely punished, it is used. And when power decides to make order, it does so first with paper, then with bodies. The sentence for Sister Virginia would come next. The crowd waited. The scribes waited. Even the bells seemed to hold their breath. The church found itself in a dilemma it could neither escape nor delay. To condemn Virginia de Leyva to death would risk outrage among the noble houses of Lombardy. Her family's lineage reached deep into both Spanish and Italian courts. But to absolve her would endanger something far greater: the church's authority in an age already cracking under the weight of scandal and reform. So in 1608, the verdict was crafted with surgical precision, half mercy, half warning. Sister Virginia Maria de Leyva was declared guilty of grievous transgressions against her vows and of having corrupted the sanctity of her order. Yet in recognition of her noble birth, her life was spared. The sentence: perpetual confinement in the convent of Santa Valeria, Milan. No visitors, no conversation, no end. It was a punishment designed to imitate purgatory. She was taken there under guard, veiled and silent as crowds lined the streets. Some jeered, others crossed themselves. A few simply watched, trying to glimpse in her face some trace of remorse or pride or both. When the gates of Santa Valeria closed behind her, the Monza scandal officially ended and the legend began. Her new cell was small, barely large enough to stand and kneel. The walls were bare limestone, damp to the touch, and the only light filtered through a slit so narrow it could not show the sky. She was allowed 1 meal a day, 1 hour for prayer, and no human contact. Not even her confessors were permitted to speak to her beyond ritual absolution. In that isolation, imagination did what the church feared most: it multiplied. The guards who tended her quarters whispered that she spoke to no one for months, that her lips moved only in silent prayer or curses. Some claimed that at night they heard screams from behind her door, cries that began as human and ended as something else. Others said she had scratched words into the walls with a piece of iron torn from her bedframe, confessions, pleas, or madness written in her own blood. No record confirms these stories, yet absence of proof has never stopped a story from surviving. Those tales spread through Milan and Monza like incense, through air, impossible to contain, fragrant with fear. By the time Virginia died, sometime around 1650, she was no longer a woman in chains. She was a spectre, the embodiment of temptation, punished guilt, confined, and sin that refuses to die. The church buried her quietly without ceremony, as if by erasing ritual, it could erase memory. But memory is a stubborn thing. In every retelling, Virginia grew not in flesh, but in symbolism. To some, she became the warning of what happens when passion challenges obedience. To others, a tragic victim crushed beneath the hypocrisy of her time. And like all powerful myths, hers refused to remain buried. 2 centuries later, in 1827, the Italian novelist Alessandro Manzoni revived her story in I Promessi Sposi, The Betrothed. In his pages, she reappeared as La Monaca di Monza, the Nun of Monza, a woman torn between piety and desire, innocence and corruption. Manzoni softened her crimes, recast her sins as symbols. His version was less historical than human, a portrait of fragility under tyranny, a mirror of the church's suffocating structures and the loneliness of the soul within them. Through Manzoni, the historical Virginia became immortal, transfigured from sinner into allegory, from condemned woman into cautionary tale. The legend rippled outward. Painters depicted her face behind bars, half lit by candlelight. Playwrights staged her as a ghost wandering the cloisters of Monza. Even travellers to Lombardy claimed centuries later to hear her footsteps echoing in the corridors of Santa Valeria. Each retelling layered new meanings over the same unanswerable question. Was she a monster who betrayed her vows, or a victim crushed by the machinery that enforced them? In the end, it no longer mattered. The woman had died, the myth had taken her place. In every age that retold her name, Virginia de Leyva lived again, not as a body but as an idea, a warning, a reflection, a haunting reminder that institutions may imprison a person, but never fully control what that person becomes in memory. In the years that followed Virginia de Leyva's death, the church did what it always did with stories too dangerous to forget and too shameful to remember. It locked them away. The original trial records, depositions and letters that had once fed the gossip of Milan were sealed under ecclesiastical custody, guarded in the archives of the Curia. A few scholars in later centuries claimed to have seen them only to describe gaps, redacted sections or pages removed. It was as if history itself had been carefully edited, not rewritten, but strategically silenced. That silence became part of the myth. What was hidden drew more fascination than what was known. Each missing page gave birth to new versions, new questions. Historians debated whether the church had suppressed the documents to protect its image or to spare the memory of a woman already punished beyond measure. Either way, the result was the same. Virginia's story no longer belonged to law, it belonged to imagination. And imagination travelled fast. Across Europe, similar scandals began to surface, like mirrors reflecting the same pattern. In France, in 1634, the convent of Loudun erupted into chaos when Ursuline nuns claimed to be possessed, accusing the priest Urbain Grandier of witchcraft and seduction, a case that ended with his execution in a continent divided between believers and skeptics. In the German states, investigations into unholy behaviour in cloisters exposed the same tensions between faith repression and human desire. Even in Spain, where secrecy was law, whispers of hidden pregnancies, forbidden liaisons, and mysterious deaths circulated through noble courts and inquisitorial reports, quickly buried but never erased. Protestant reformers eager to wound Rome used these stories like arrows. Pamphlets and sermons painted the convent not as a house of virtue but as a cage of hypocrisy. The scandals of Monza and Loudun became proof that enforced purity breeds its own corruption. And though the church tried to reclaim control of the narrative, the damage was done. The image of the fallen nun, half victim, half sinner, entered Europe's collective consciousness, a symbol of the cost of absolute obedience. 4 centuries later, what remains of Virginia de Leyva is not her crime nor even her punishment, but a question that refuses to fade. Was she a monster, a woman who deceived, betrayed, and killed to protect her passions? Or was she a victim shaped, cornered, and crushed by a system that denied her the right to be human before demanding that she be holy? Perhaps she was both. Perhaps that is the lesson history keeps repeating when power dictates morality. The line between sin and survival dissolves. Virginia's story endures not because it is unique, but because it is universal. It reveals how institutions, religious, political, even cultural construct cages and then call them virtues. It reminds us that beneath every rule of obedience lies a human face, and beneath every legend a person who once breathed hoped and made one fatal choice too many. The Monza scandal was not only about one woman's downfall, it was about the architecture of control, how fear keeps societies orderly, how guilt keeps them obedient. The sealed archives of the church may never open, but we do not need to read them to understand their meaning. Every footnote in them speaks. And so the question passes from the 17th century to us when the systems we build leave no room for freedom, when morality becomes performance and compassion becomes weakness. Who then are the real sinners? Virginia de Leyva's voice may be lost to time, but the echo of her story remains in every society that still confuses obedience with virtue and punishment with justice. Her tragedy is not only history's wound, it is its mirror. History often disguises its most valuable lessons inside its tragedies. The story of Virginia de Leyva, the noblewoman turned nun, the sinner turned legend, reminds us that behind every scandalized name lies a system that created the conditions for the fall. Hers was not only the tale of a forbidden love, it was the anatomy of power, how control breeds rebellion, and how silence once enforced long enough becomes complicity. Virginia lived in a world that worshipped obedience more than truth. The church, the family, the state all demanded submission as proof of virtue. A young girl's will was not her own. Her life was arranged like property negotiated through vows she never chose. Inside the convent, piety was measured in endurance and freedom was an illusion painted in gold leaf. It was only a matter of time before something inside her broke. We like to believe that our age is different, that the cages of faith and family have given way to choice and self-expression. Yet the mechanisms that trapped Virginia still exist in quieter forms. We live in societies that reward conformity, where success is often defined by obedience to structures we did not design. The question her story poses is timeless: how much of what we call virtue is genuine conviction, and how much is fear of punishment? Virginia's descent into secrecy and guilt teaches another hard truth. When honesty becomes impossible, corruption becomes inevitable. Every lie she told to preserve her love only deepened the darkness around her. In trying to protect what was human in herself, she participated in a system of harm she once despised. That paradox between survival and integrity is one we all face in smaller ways. We silence parts of ourselves to keep peace, to keep jobs, to keep appearances. But silence, if left too long, reshapes the soul. Her punishment, isolation unto death, mirrors the loneliness that comes from being misunderstood by one's own world. Yet even within that confinement, Virginia's memory refused to die. Centuries later, she was reimagined by writers, painted by artists, discussed by scholars. What society sought to erase, memory resurrected. The lesson is, powerful truth may be buried, but it never vanishes. Time has a way of exhuming what repression tries to hide. From Virginia's story, we can draw 3 enduring insights. First, freedom without compassion becomes cruelty. A society obsessed with rules will always sacrifice someone to preserve its image. Second, silence is never neutral. When we remain quiet in the face of injustice, we help sustain it. And third, every legend of wrongdoing begins as a cry for dignity. Behind the myths we inherit are people who wanted simply to live, love, and choose. To study her life is not to excuse her, but to understand how easily humanity bends under systems that demand perfection. When we judge her, we must also judge the walls that confine her. In the end, Virginia de Leyva's tragedy endures because it mirrors our own condition, the eternal struggle between duty and desire, faith and freedom, conformity and selfhood. Her voice, silenced by stone yet immortal in story whispers, a final warning: Any world that demands blind obedience will eventually create the very rebellion it fears. Thanks for being here. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next chapters full of history and discovery.